Well, welcome to the next episode of the Christ-Centered Cosmic Civilization, and we're continuing to look at St. Augustine with his family, and we're going to look at his brother, Navigius. Now, why this is important? Well, let me put it in this context, that way back, I must have been like maybe 20 or 21, and I purchased 28 volumes of early church fathers, which have been my sort of companion for 35 years, about 35 years. And I just got into reading them. I was even reading these church fathers back in my teen years before I owned that big set. And it was interesting to me because when I was reading them all, I hadn't got any secondary literature, and nobody I knew knew anything not really about them. Or certainly I wasn't having discussions with people about them or anything like that, and there was no YouTube, no podcasts. I didn't have any access to any theological library in that sense. It never occurred to me, even when I was doing my degree, it didn't really occur to me to read like lots of secondary literature about them. I was just kind of reading them from teenage years and onwards. And so I was reading them and enjoying all that they had to say, but also seeing the struggles and how they were trying to understand things and express things. And sometimes I thought, oh, yeah, I get that, or no, I'm not totally convinced by that, but I like your attitude. Or sometimes I'm like, whoa, I don't know what's going on there, and things like that. Was my experience of it. So I read them a lot, and sometimes massive amounts of annotations in some of the works and things. And then it was strange to me. So then I began to share what I was learning at times in context and things. But then I've noticed, particularly, in the past 20, particularly more recently, 20 years, and then more so in the past 10 or even 5 years, I meet people who really confidently say things like, the church fathers say this. And they kind of distill church fathers to basically whatever is their theological viewpoint. And they say that with this confidence that really comes from the assurance that no one you're talking to has read them. So everyone sort of goes, I guess that must be it, because this guy says that's what they all say. And that has always struck me as strange, because they don't say the same thing. They're like incredibly diverse in their views on all sorts of things. And obviously the core of the gospel and the confession of the living God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and who Jesus is and what he's done, the core of that obviously is our creedal faith, the constant gospel. But in terms of the real theological detail, it's incredibly diverse, and they often say things that are quite contradictory to each other. And even at the time, they argued kind of with each other, even sometimes politely, sometimes not so politely, in letters. And there's discussions, debates. There's the something, that one approach is better, is the right one, and other people take very different views. That's what I say that because I've met people who have told me, if you read the Church Fathers, you'll see they were all Roman Catholics, or they were all Greek Orthodox. And the advocates of this are very, very confident that they all the completely align with the particular denomination. And then Protestants do it too. I've had quite a lot of guys who will say, the view of God we take, that's the view that all the early church fathers take. And in fact, some of them have told me, if you really read the fathers, you'll discover they're actually all evangelical Protestants or something like that. And again, I'm like, I'm not sure that's true. And it particularly happens with Augustine, where some people even say, oh, he's really a reformed theologian or something. And again, like I can see, with any church father, you can see some ways in which the great historic faith is there, but none of those things are plausible to me, because when you read them in their rich fullness, there's a lot more to them than that, and they have strange ideas, and they develop as well, that the things that they teach early in their life and write about, then you read them much later in life and you discover in the main they get a lot better. They tend to become more closer to the Bible, and because they start to kind of, I guess, work through some of the baggage they're carrying, the pagan philosophical baggage, and tend. That's not entirely true though, because with Augustine you will see he's still wrestling with his pagan philosophical baggage right the way through to the end of his life. Now I say all that because all this kind of ideological baggage that comes to the study of Augustine means that, as we've seen, those around Augustine get kind of ground under in theological machines, because they're like, oh, well, that, his sister, forget her, or his brother's an idiot, or his mum, she's just obsessed with Augustine, and we've been having a look at these things, or Patrick, he's rubbish, and all this sort of thing. And none of it's true to life. And with Navigius, who is the brother of Augustine, he tends to get looked on very badly because he's not like Augustine really in his manner of Christian life. And he gets dismissed quite a lot. So I'm going to bring PJ in a moment, but I came across, W.H.C. Friend, the great sort of early church historian, and he says about Navigius that he was probably the most representative member of the curial class in his family at this period, being nominally a Christian, liberal-minded, skeptical of authority, and believing that happiness could be found through inquiry and quest. So he sees him as a kind of skeptically minded, nominal Christian, and he's also said to have had delicate health, and that was this idea, he's a fragile soul, but not really a strong Christian, kind of really just a sort of skeptic. And I've also heard it said of him that he Peter Brown, the great Augustine sort of biographer, notes that Navigius was the only one of the group of friends around Augustine who persistently refused to see the point of what his brother was saying. So he's sometimes portrayed as a bit sort of stupid, like, he just doesn't get what Augustine's talking about. What an idiot. And Peter Brown isn't that, I guess, leaving it slightly open that maybe he did understand it, but rejected what Augustine was saying. But is there the underlying idea where he just doesn't understand it? He's not thinking on the really deep level of Augustine. Now, I'm setting all that up because let me just start with that to PJ. Is this a fair view of Navigius? And first of all, is that a fair view of Navigius?
Well, yeah, it's a common one. And I think, again, like with the others, I think the big villain is adhering too much to the confessions, but also not even reading the confessions properly. Like those two things seems to have affected everything that touches Augustine, that within popular, sometimes even some academic, but not very thoroughly academic, but even within some academic stuff, this idea of just lightly touching upon some parts of Augustine, taking things out of context, or ironically refusing to see the point Augustine's trying to make, people come to these conclusions. So with Navigius, I think what really makes people kind of hate him is that there's a moment when Monica's dying, and she calls Navigius and Augustine to her and says, basically, I'm going to die soon. And she's been thinking about this a lot. And so she basically says, don't bother with a big funeral. That plot of land I'd bought in Africa to be buried next to Patrick, don't bother with that. Just leave me here and get on with your ministries. And then Augustine is so stunned that she said this, because she was adamant she wanted to be buried next to Patrick just like days before. And then, but Navigius actually says, it's like, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to take you back to Africa. And then she just kind of rolls her eyes and looks at Augustine. And because he's been stunned into silence, she thinks he's being spiritual and just contemplating it. And then she's like, oh, can you believe, Navigius, that you're saying this? But obviously, actually, Augustine was thinking the exact same thing. And he tells us this, but people take it out of context as if like they're taking Monica's perspective and not reading Augustine's overthinking about his own inner life, which is the whole point of Augustine. But they're not even doing that this time, so it's baffling why they do that to me. But
so Augustine is, because he's always navel gazing, isn't he, sort of thing, very psychologically inward looking, so he's like basically just thinking it through and going, yeah, I agree with like Navigius, basically. Yeah. And yet people go, oh, Monica's looking at him like, what is he like? And I can imagine that. Okay. Yeah. So Navigius in that exchange is made to look foolish, whereas a basic Augustine takes exactly the same view as Navigius.
Yeah. And sometimes they might say that Monica expected Augustine to be more spiritual because that had been the pattern of life. But as we've thought about his life, like up until very shortly before that point, he was a pagan. So that's not really true at all. But that's the passage that makes people turn on Navigius. And so mostly people only ever engage with him there in that passage where he's not even named in the Confessions. But if anyone ever engaged with him on a popular level, it tends to be that. Some people then, when they get to his dialogues, the Cassiacum...
Augustine's. Yeah, right.
And so Navigius is there with him.
The
Cassiacum, I might be mispronouncing that as well. But those dialogues they have, Augustine and his family, as he's a catechumen and as he's thinking things through, getting ready to be baptized, he has these dialogues with his family, and that includes Navigius. So some people I've noticed who basically start with the dialogues, and that's where they first encounter Navigius, quite like him, and they think he's very thought through, very thoughtful, but doesn't say much. But he seems to be several steps ahead of Augustine. He seems to know what Augustine's like, and tries to give him little warnings about like theological, philosophical, and just the thought process loops and problems and pitfalls he falls into, and he's kind of aware of what's going to happen several lines down. Whereas Augustine he was a professor of rhetoric, so he uses his rhetoric to wow people, and they're all like, "Wow, that's right." Augustine's like figured it out again, and then Navigius like, "Well, I'm not sure," and that sort of thing. But he usually gives subtle clues. But as you see Augustine think through things later, he falls into exactly what Navigius said.
So is Navigius an older brother?
It seems scholarly sources I've read say he is, but in popular devotion and stuff, they tend to say Augustine is.
Oh, yeah, we've been through that. Yeah. People always want Augustine. He's the firstborn, he's the special one. Yeah. And that is like, no, he actually isn't. Yeah. So let's. I've heard that Navigius is older than him. And I do. It's funny because my experience of Augustine, I've loved Augustine throughout my life. And because he is so compelling in the way he writes, and I find that sometimes I'll be thinking I don't think Augustine's right about something, and then I read him, and then I'm like, I am caught even now reading him sort of more than 1,500 years later. the power of his rhetoric and charisma comes through. And then I spend like maybe 2 or 3 hours like caught up in reading him or something. And then I'm like, oh man, that is amazing. He's so like, what a brilliant vision. What a great way of putting it. And then I might go and have a cup of tea, go for a walk. And then I'm starting to go, hang on. Like, that isn't what the Bible says. Like, he never mentioned Jesus once, or, like, it's the power of his rhetoric. So what you're saying is, like, Navigius was like that, but he could see through it more quickly. Like, it takes me quite a long time to overcome, like, Augustine's rhetorical power and to sort of engage with him critically. I find it hard when I'm reading him because he's such a good communicator. And even when he's saying things that are like, I'm really not buying, like when he's saying like, oh, the Trinity, there isn't any Trinity in the Old Testament. It's like you can't read Trinity. Like the Old Testament doesn't give you any reason to make Trinitarian distinctions. And I'm like, what nonsense. But even then, when I'm reading him, I'm sort of like, wow, he's a very good writer and everything. But I guess Navigius, as an older brother, is able to go, nah, mate, look, maybe gets him in a headlock or something and rubs his head or something and goes, what are you talking about? But basically he's grown up with him and isn't so easily bewitched by the rhetoric of Augustine and more quickly goes, hang on, because we know Monica does that. She pops his balloon a bit and just says, no, you can't have that. That doesn't make any sense. And it sounds as if Navigius is thinking really deeply and just sees, here we go, I can see exactly where Augustine's heading and he's going to fall over the following thing. So he kind of, he's no less clever or thought through, but he certainly isn't, he doesn't speak as much as Augustine.
Yeah, and so there's a big difference I've found with biographers of Navigius. So there's those who start with confessions and they see him as unspiritual because of that. And then there's people who look at that and they're quite amazed that he can see through Augustine. And then you start to think, well, when you're picking apart, like, you can't just rely on their words because there's all this rhetoric going on and everything. You can't figure out, who's the more spiritual. I found a lot of historical ones say Navigius is more spiritual and closer to Jesus because he's got all these kids who become nuns and preachers. One of them becomes like an archdeacon and things.
I heard that they all kind of lived in part of this sort of commune and thing. Yeah.
That he kind of has a role. So we thought at Monica's role in starting the Augustinian monastic or canonry tradition. Navigius also has a big part in this because he raises so many of his kids and encourages his cousins and nephews and so on to become monastic and everything. So that wasn't the path he went down. That wasn't his ministry. But he sees the sort of the wealth and the importance of it, and so he does kind of establish the Augustinian tradition, or with Monica he's key in that. So that's a key part that historically people notice. So Robert Wheeler Bush, so we had this other biography of him, but there's Robert Wheeler Bush says Navigius' life was wholly dedicated to meditation and prayer. And you can see that because of his family and things. So then you do think, there's these two. So when you sometimes just got two different opinions and they don't reach a conclusion, or perhaps because Augustine's writing, he doesn't allow there to be a conclusion reached, but maybe Navigius would feel that he had properly told Augustine off. But then you're kind of thinking, who's the better one? And so people always choose Augustine just because they start with the confessions and everything, and that's the impression they get from taking bits out of context. But historically, as I say, people were really feeling Navigius was, just from the fruits of his labour and his own life. So Augustine ends up, he only works a miracle right at the end, at the siege in which he dies, isn't it? In the very year.
Yeah, tell us about that. Mm.
So, the Vandals, when they'd been sieging down Hippo, so then they're planning to take it and they want to burn the city down. And then Augustine, in this time where there's starvation and there's disease breaks out and everything, he does finally start working miracles. He can heal people and he can duplicate food and, you know. And
so that's why he struggles to be canonized by the Universal Church, because he's like, he only really gets a couple of miracles in right at the end. It's like, wow, he should have been doing them for longer than that. Yeah.
Whereas with Navigius, I mean, it seems that he has fruits to show of it from way earlier on and throughout his entire life. And these people continue, his children and, you know, so on. They continue to impress people that knew Augustine and Augustine himself and all of this for decades to come. So he's got real signs of holiness and real fruits to show that it will take ages for Augustine. So he does end up catching up with Navigius, but that is something that struck a lot of historical biographers.
But did we know whether he was academically trained or not?
He was, yeah. Augustine mentions that he was. But I think more in philosophy and logic rather than
rhetoric.
Which, yeah, Augustine was exactly the other way. And so he mentions all the stories and Homer and stuff he could do quite well, I think. But the logic and the philosophy, not so much.
And it does look as if Navigius, though, is not as invested in the academic process, perhaps, as Augustine had been. Because we know Monica is very sceptical of certainly the pagan academic system, the Athenian sort of academy. So it could be that Navigius he's been through it and is not so impressed by it, maybe, because it is that problem. Again, people will tend to think, oh well, Navigius, he isn't so academic as Augustine, and therefore he isn't as clever, or therefore he isn't as deep, or something. And I think we've already in this podcast at times explored the problem with that. Like I've often said that the sharpest theological thinkers that I know, I think about, say, the top 2 or 3 people I've ever met who are really sharp about theology, understanding the scriptures, the living. None of them are academically trained, or maybe one of them a little bit. And similarly, that kind of fruitfulness of the Christian life, really being fruitful and deep, again, not academically trained people. And so it could be like Navigius is, that Navigius gets put down because he hasn't produced these academic books. People are like, he's obviously not important. Yeah.
And also people seem to get very interested by how, as you said, navel-gazing Augustine is and introverted, and he's all about contemplating. But for the first half of his life, that gets him into all kinds of trouble and gets him a son born out of wedlock and all of this. So there's not good fruits from it. So people just seem to assume because he's contemplative and because he's all of that, that's good to contemplate God is the best thing. But then it's like, well, what if you're kind of living in God the way Navigius is?
Because everyone knows Augustine going, Lord, make me chaste, but not yet. So in other words, he's busy thinking about being chaste, whereas Navigius is like, no, just do it. Stop thinking about it, get on with it. And that's a much more biblical attitude to have. Tell us more about him then.
So there's 2 moments in particular in the dialogues, the Cassiacum dialogues, that kind of stood out to me. So one of them, and this is one that annoys people, and you can tell why, because it's like they want Augustine to be right, but he kind of isn't. So Augustine is basically saying we can just know things. So he's talking about like a priori knowledge, like you can, without evidence, intrinsically know something. So that's
like a neo-Platonic thing then, isn't it? Yeah.
Because Plato had that idea when you give someone a rhetorical argument for something and then they go like, then it's like the same reaction to remembering something. And so it's like you always knew it and it's just coming to mind again. So Plato's very keen on that sort of knowledge, in inverted commas, and Navigius is not at all. And so Augustine, he's just like, well, look, we all know some things, like we're composed of body and soul. And Navigius is like, no, we don't know that. Like intrinsically, at least.
He's like, we don't know that.
Yeah.
And then Navigius could just be saying, well, Aristotle would say body, soul, and spirit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Loads of people think that's exactly what he's doing, a tripartite sort of. Yeah.
Yeah, I personally think the Bible is definitely tripartite, but not for Aristotelian reasons.
Yeah.
I think if Aristotle is right on that, it's probably because he's nicking it from the Bible.
Yeah, definitely. And so he just does that, and then there's a bit of a debate, and so he ends up kind of hesitantly, Augustine's like, all right, so can we just say, like, you have at least a body and a soul? Because they sort of argue
at
you've
least
got
that.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Because you can't have a body without a soul that's died or something. And so he's hesitant because, like, you can't prove it's a different substance that is a soul that's given it life. But he kind of hesitantly is like, all right, for the sake of argument, goes along with it, but then says, but you could only say at minimum we're composed of body and soul. Like, you could be composed of way more things. And so as we're thinking, the tripartite thing comes to mind, but maybe there's even more. And because he doesn't even go down the tripartite thing, because he's like, who knows what we're composed of a priori. So if you have, is it secundi, or, this? Secondary knowledge, that's like through evidence, that you've been able to witness something, and through evidence or proof, even better, come to a proper conclusion, so he says that's better. And so it's like, so we don't just know things of ourselves. And so people, that's one where people are always like, oh, he's always missing the point. And
it's like, no, he's like not buying a neo-Platonic kind of system. And he's like, no, you must like find out knowledge rather than just already assume you know it. Yeah. And of course, from a modern perspective, we're like the great revolution of the sort of 16th and 17th, particularly 16th century Francis Bacon, is him saying, let us not just like go from intuitions, but let us be experimental. Let us assume we need to find out knowledge, not that we've already got it. And we would now go, well, that's way better way of proceeding.
Yeah, absolutely. So, is that where he's not missing the point, but he's noticed that Augustine, through rhetoric, has skipped over a whole load of basic building blocks that he hasn't established, like why we should depend on a priori knowledge rather than seeking out evidence and proofs. So he wants to deal with that before they move on, but then Augustine keeps trying to move everyone, and everyone else wants to move on because everyone's at that moment enamored by what Augustine's saying. So Navigius is like, all right, I won't hold everything back, but we can see exactly why he's doubting Augustine, and he's noticed something quite intrinsic.
I like Navigius the more I find out about him. I suspect if I'd been in that group, I'd have been part of the crowd that would be enamoured, and I'd be like, oh yeah, shut up, mate. I just want to hear more of what Augustine has to say. But Navigius, he's good, isn't he? Because he's just saying, no, hang on, we don't actually know that. Yeah. Very good. I like him more and more. Tell us something else about him.
So there was another thing that popped up between him and Augustine. So usually he does just keep quiet, and he just kind of quietly nods or something, he does, which again is why people think he's stupid. Some people call him dull, some people writing about him. But of course the Bible says it's wiser to not speak often, to if you can hold your tongue, and the Bible asks who can do this, but Navigius can. So he's a very holy person, and that shows it, very wise biblically. And Augustine, who's just running away with conclusions, would be less wise biblically. So anyway, in one of these few moments he does speak up, we see, so Augustine is basically trying to find out what it means to be happy or blessed, or, it's that.
Was that in his book called The Blessed or Happy Life?
I think so, although he touches on it.
He does it often,
times,
he often talks about it,
So then they're kind of discussing like whether or not you can be happy without. So Augustine has said like what we're all looking for is God, and so you can only be happy once you've reached God. And then they're like, well, anyone who doesn't have what they're looking for would be like a fool. And so then basically Navigius is pointing out, well, he's thinking you are a catechumen who's not yet baptized, who's not yet in the church. All the things when we saw with Patrick, when he was a catechumen and everything, Augustine thought quite low of him, and he wasn't, so he thought like he's not yet got God.
So let me just clarify again. Augustine's saying, like, you're happy if you find God. But then he goes, but you're happy even if you're just looking for God, kind of like that. And then Navigius is like, well, hang on. Yeah, carry on. Yeah. So
he kind of, he does kind of agree. Or like we can bring up, I think we had a quotation from Navigius on if we can bring, or if not, I guess it's fine. But he does just kind of show there's a problem in Augustine's logic.
Yeah, because he's effectively saying that a person who is not yet a Christian but searching is as blessed as a person who is already a Christian. And of course, Navigius is like, well, hang on. Like, your logic is you've just fallen into an absolute car crash because you're not, if you're not baptized and you've not yet been brought into the life of God, it's good that you're searching, but that is not the state of blessedness and happiness.
Yeah. And so Navigius, knowing Augustine's in this sort of state, so then they do that, and so then
Augustine himself is not baptized at that point. Oh my days!
The gall, innit?
The gall.
So Navigius is just like, so ultimately they agree, and Augustine does agree with Navigius, and he's like, so the academics, they are not blessed, and they're not happy, and they're all fools. And so everyone agrees with him there. They're like, oh, well said, Augustine. And then Augustine's like, oh, will Navigius agree with this? He's just going to be awkward again. And then Navigius says, no, this is very... And so Augustine does this metaphor with like desserts or something. He said, like, I've served up this lovely dessert of having a go at the academics. And so they're all saying, oh, we love this. But then he says, I bet Navigius won't like it because he's always bitter about things. But he says, because he's got this problem with his spleen, he's probably going to hate it. And then he says, no, it's fine for me. I think it's going to be bitter for you. And he doesn't elaborate on that. But of course, he's thinking, what you're saying, Augustine, is like, you don't have this knowledge of God and everything. And you're talking about God all the time. But you can't, by your own logic you've just laid out, that can't be true. So he points this out, but he does it quite subtly because he doesn't want to undermine Augustine. And he's obviously happy that Augustine is getting into theology and everything. But he has noticed a problem that Augustine's come into, and it doesn't come apparent for Augustine until much later. But he's already noticed
I like that. So he's saying, look, if you really think that through, happiness is to be found in knowing the living God, and you don't, that is a problem for you. You're confidently declaring this, but you yourself need to be examined. I like Navigius. Yeah. He comes across to me as like really wise, like a really mature Christian who is, and that his maturity is manifested in his life, his own children, and also the way he handles Augustine. He's like, he doesn't put him down, but he does kind of stand up to him, and he's not bewitched by him. But he also is able to just sort of say, hang on, think this through, and that kind of thing. He's a great brother, isn't he, for Augustine?
Yeah, absolutely. And he does always seem to have been supportive, and they do seem to have loved each other, and they do banter a bit, and so you can tell. Yeah. In one of the dialogues, he doesn't appear in the dialogue because he's taking Augustine's son out to town, and they have a nice time, which is lovely. So there's loads of lovely things about him.
And that's good, isn't it? Because Augustine's son dies comparatively young, doesn't he, really? He's only in his 20s, I think, or something, and it'd be good to have his sort of uncle Navigius, who's such a godly saint, looking out for him and sort of perhaps giving him a slightly more grounded version. I don't know. I don't want to. I mean, Augustine's awesome, isn't he? We all love him. But what we've done in this little series of 4 of the podcast is try to kind of flesh out our vision of Augustine and show his humanity, but also his family context. And hopefully that makes him more alive to us and more human to us. And we see, I personally find that the more I understand these great saints, I'm calling him a saint there, yeah, that's true. These great saints and church leaders, the more we do that, I find it makes us appreciate them more, and we relate to them more, and see how we can walk in their steps more, and that they're not artificial people, but real people. And hope that after, and we've got to wind this up now, but I hope what this has done is made you want to read Augustine. There's the City of God, there's his Confessions, but what other books might there be? He writes one on Christian doctrine, which is okay. It's not one of my favourites, but he writes commentary on the Psalms, things like that.
And the Psalms is better, much more Jesus-centered.
Yeah, that's one of his
stuff.
best works.
Yeah,
he's less good on some of the other things, I think, and but the Psalms one is one of the best, and the Happy Life, and what else does he do?
All the Cassiacum dialogue, so Against the Academics is good. Just you think the title is awesome.
The title's a winner,
and his letters
are good, And then he gets into some exchanges with Jerome, doesn't he? And Jerome sort of tells him off a bit and things like that.
But he can also tell Jerome off, which is interesting, and very few people can do that.
No, they're both like titans, really.
Yeah.
So I know I've sometimes been bringing Augustine down to size a bit because I'm trying to enable his family to come into focus. But in truth, Augustine is a titan, and he's able to stand up to Jerome. And as you say, Jerome is actually quite an ornery character, and Augustine is able to do that. Maybe at some point we'll put we'll examine Jerome and have a look at what he was up to, because it's very, very interesting, all the things he does and the views he takes, and he's involved in the post-Nicene use of language and also anyway, no, let's not touch him. So that's Augustine. I hope you're inspired to read him, to enjoy him, but also enjoy his family.